Hey, this is Brock from Eagle Crest Studios, and today I'm going to be showing you how we can turn this old log into a beautiful, clean, sleek, black end table that I'm going to give to my parents. Now let's get started. Now I want to thank Cam from Blacktail Studios for inspiring this video. This is his, and this is what I'm going for. So let's see how it turns out. So a few months back, I bought a house, and the first thing that happened was the insurance company was giving me such a hard time about all the trees. And granted, everything was a little bit overgrown, and it looked like something coming out of the Lorax. I need to do some work, so unfortunately, I had to hire some guys to chop down some of the trees around my house, even though I wanted to keep them. And as a result, I got a bunch of wood. But because I don't have a lot of patience, I wanted to get started on this project right away. So what I'm doing here is actually trying to dry it in my oven. Well, it turns out my oven wasn't big enough. So what I'm doing right now is ripping off all the extra bark so I can try to squeeze it in. And as you can see, I'm really kind of making a mess of this because, I'm not using the proper tools. I'm just using a claw hammer and trying to get it done quickly. But you know what? We were able to get it tossed in there. And what we're doing now is baking it for roughly 30 minutes on each side. So I was staying at home to monitor this. I recommend not doing this because it's not really the safest, most practical way. But it got the job done for what I was doing, and that's all that really matters. So we're going through this process, and we can see, if you dry wood that's wet, it's been sitting out for a few months, but it's going to crack, as you see here. And I didn't really mind that cracking because what I'm going to do next is actually end up burning it. So the actual cracks in here are going to give it a little bit better texture and show a little bit more of the wood that I want to compare it to if it was just completely clean. So while I was talking before about how I need to clean this up, one of my good friends, Ryan, who's in New Hampshire, actually sent me an early wedding present and sent me these chisels. These are DeWalt Standard 4 chisels, and they were a lifesaver. So as you can see here, I'm just ripping right through all of this rotting wood, and it was such a great help to have these wedding presents come a little bit early, and I was able to get great use out of them. So Ryan, thank you very much. So the interesting thing about wood like this is that you're actually able to hear the difference between the solid wood, the rotting wood, and even the wood that's about to crumble off. So this next clip, you're going to see the first part I hit is solid, the second part's a little bit rotting, and the last part is really about to fall off. So as you can see there, it was interesting to see how the different state the wood was in actually offered a different sound when you hit it with the hammer. So this next part here, we're just cleaning up the inside using a rasp, aka Rasputin. And what this is doing is actually making our edges a little bit safer because we don't want anything to be cracking with the sharp edges of wood. Sometimes that tends to happen. So the fact that we round off this edge a little bit still keeps the natural look, but also gives it a more smooth and stronger appeal. Now, I know I keep talking about this, but I do love these DeWalt chisels that I got. And like I said, it's not anything I'm sponsored by. It's literally just a gift my buddy sent me at the perfect time. But these were great. They really took care of both the inside and then also the bark of the wood with different styles. There's some shorter ones, more narrow ones, and you had wide ones here that were able to actually take off a lot of the bark. So if you get a chance, I highly recommend getting these or even just another nice set of chisels because when you need to get something cleaned up like this, it can save you a ton of time. Now, as we're going through this, I just want to let you know that I appreciate all the viewership and all the help on this. If you got any value from this video, we're going to have a lot more coming later. If you could, please like and subscribe. It really helps to get the channel going and get people out there. If you want to share it with someone who might find this interesting or someone who might want this table, always just please do that. Thank you so much. So now back to the regular program. I cleaned off all the bark, and what I was doing there is just sanding up the edges to make it smooth. But I had one issue, was that when I cut this with the chainsaw, there was a little bit of a gap where I first came in. And as you can see, it's a little bit of an edge. So I started by first trying to sand it out. But then I realized that's going to be a lot of sanding. So I went back to the trusty chisels to get the heavy stuff off. And then I'm going to come back with a sander. Now, if you have a planer or something that you can take it to a bigger belt sander, that's another great option. I didn't have access to that right now, and this piece was wider than my planer, so I couldn't really use that, and this was my only option. I'd also recommend here is to make sure you clamp down your pieces. I spent most of my time fighting this because I didn't think it'd be that hard, but honestly, if I had to do it all over again, I would have taken the 2 seconds just to clamp this down or put something in there so it wasn't sliding around when I was sanding it and also when I was using the chisel. So as you can see, this is a pretty dusty process. I don't have a ductwork system set up yet to suck up all the dust, but that's something I'm hoping to add in my shop at some point. It's nice to have, but not the end of the world if you don't have it right now. And now that we're all set, we actually have both sides cleaned up and sanded. I'm leaving a little bit of texture on the bottom side because no one's really going to see that, and I kind of like the little attribute it has. But now we're ready for the fun step of burning this bad boy. So it's the next day, and we're actually down at the other shop because this is Fire Safety 101. And what we're doing here is just using a simple plumber's torch to burn the wood. So we already have it dried out, but we want to give it a nice charred effect. And this is something you pick up from any hardware or Home Depot store around your area. The interesting thing about this is that you can really see how the cracks are being highlighted. Now I really like this look because it gives texture to what a plain piece of wood would normally be. And what I'd recommend here also too is not trying this at home. I had a bunch of water around me. I was in a safe area, so my neighbors were not worried about me burning down their house or any of our houses in the neighborhood. But like I said, please be careful, and I do not recommend you doing this at home. It's not worth burning your house down or anything else down. Now back to it, we're just going and covering the entire section of this, and I tried to get a nice even burn, but because this wood still was a little bit wet, it wasn't taking off like you would have in a fireplace or in a hearth or something like that. It was a little bit wet, so it smoldered a little bit more, which made it safer, but also took a little bit more time. Now, one thing I forgot to mention about this is that you have to be careful when you burn this because both sides will bend actually. And as you can see here, I got it pretty level, but in this next clip, you're gonna see how it actually shakes a little bit when I go to push on it. So what I'm gonna do is actually touch it up a little bit more. If you burn it, it bends towards that side. So if you're a welder, you can probably explain this more than I can. But something with the heat actually moves the molecules and moves the board, so you're gonna get a warping effect. But when you have a bigger piece like this, it's not as bad compared to a smaller, thinner piece. All right, so this is where the tricky part begins. So now that we have everything burned, we actually have to seal our piece of wood because there's gonna be so many bubbles that come out of all these little cracks that I mentioned that if we just pour directly on it, it's gonna cause a major issue. There are gonna be a lot of bubbles and it's gonna look really bad. So I'm using Total Boat's Fathom Deep Pour Epoxy. And this is, I believe, a 2-to-1 mixture. And I'm just kind of eyeing up here. It doesn't have to be perfect for what we're doing right now since we're just coating it. But when we go to our other deep pour, we're actually going to have to be pretty precise with our measurements to make sure we're not wasting any, but also to make sure the epoxy actually does what it's supposed to do. So here, what we just want to do is seal in the wood as much as possible. There's really not an exact science behind this. I've seen some people use a paintbrush. Some people have used a cloth. I found just a scrap piece of wood that you get from the paint store to stir your stick is the best way to do it. And what this will do is actually allow you to spread the wood without worrying about soaking up too much if you use a cloth or a paintbrush and you end up wasting that epoxy and having to throw it away. So right now, I'm just going over everything. You can see where I covered it, where the wood's a little bit darker compared to the lighter sections where it's still not covered. And as you can see, I kind of made it a little bit of a mess here, so I had to wipe it up. But the thing about this is that it's going to be messy. It's going to be kind of stressful at times. So make sure you go in an area where you don't mind getting your floor a little bit dirty. And if you do, make sure you have something to cover it up because the last thing you need to worry about is your floor when you're trying to deal with epoxy and not getting it on your hands or breathing it in too much. Which is another thing I should mention is that I didn't have any protection on, and I recommend always wearing a mask, always wearing some type of glasses for this because if you get this in your eye, it's probably gonna be a real bad pain, and also wearing gloves. I did none of that, and I don't recommend that because that's just stupid on my part. So the good thing about this epoxy specifically is that it has a really slow working time, which means if we start it, it can be malleable for, I believe, up to 24 hours from what I read. And the thing about this is that if you don't have enough epoxy in your first mix, it's not really a big deal to take some time, mix up a second batch, and then go from there, which is what I had to do here because I didn't make enough in the first time around. Once again, not a big deal. It's better to make a second batch than to waste a bunch of epoxy because this stuff is expensive. And I think for my 1.5 gallons, it ran around $200. So be careful for your epoxy because you don't want to be wasting stuff like this. It's like liquid gold. So now that we have the first layer in, what I'm doing now is using a blowtorch to actually pop any of the bubbles. So when you use epoxy, it's depending on how you mix it, the material you're putting on, and a bunch of different factors will determine how many bubbles you have. And it's normal to get this stuff, so don't worry about it. But what you want to use is either, like I said, a blowtorch, or sometimes people will use a heat gun to make sure you pop these bubbles. The one thing I'd say is if you're gonna do what I'm doing, make sure you're careful because I wasn't smart and I was using this over paper and I almost caught the paper on fire, which would have been another hazard. So please be careful, and I do not recommend doing this at home. And if you're gonna do it, make sure you're smart with it. Now, so we make sure we don't actually stick to the bottom of the wood. We're putting down this Tyvek tape. And what this will allow us to do is to make a barrier between the wood and the actual piece of furniture we're building. So the whole point of this is just to make sure nothing sticks. It was waterproof. They use it to wrap houses, so it's pretty strong. But what you want to do is just put down a layer and then put your piece on top of that and then use this caulking. I just went to the hardware store to grab something that was water-based. So what this will do is people use this in their bathrooms and their showers and different things like that. And I went a little crazy here. I was just going to add one sealer, but I already had the can open, and you really can't seal these back up. At least I don't know of a way to. So I thought, why not? Let's make sure this doesn't leak. The epoxy is a lot more expensive than caulking. So I went over and did another layer on the bottom side and then doubled up my layer again just to make sure it was all taken care of. So I know I'm not going to win any caulking awards, but this definitely got the job done for what I needed right now. So it's also interesting too because when we make this final pour, we want to make sure our piece is level. And the reason why is when it settles, we want it to level flat, not only so it looks good, but also because if you have an unlevel piece, it's not going to look good, but you're also going to be wasting a bunch of epoxy. So what I'm doing here is just putting a level on and actually shimming up the board. And what shimming means is basically you're just putting little pieces of wood on the touch point areas so that when you go to put your level back on, it's actually straight and level. It's much easier than making big adjustments, and a lot of carpenters do this type of stuff. It's a pretty simple process. Now, like I said, caulking is a lot cheaper than epoxy. So what I'm doing here is actually putting one more layer on the inside, and this is just going to act as a third barrier just in case any other epoxy leaks out. This will be able to seal everything up so we all have it in one area and we're not going to waste any of this precious epoxy. I know I keep ranting about how expensive this epoxy is, but really it's one of the things where if you just take a little bit of time and a little bit of energy to make sure you're doing this process right, it can save you a lot of headaches later. Your project will look better and you'll save money. So I recommend doing these steps even if they seem a little bit redundant. Now this last part is actually prepping for the pour, and what you have to do is use this calculation I just found online. It's pi times the radius squared times the height. So this will actually get us the volume, and it's the volume of a cylinder, which is basically what this circle is. It's a circle with height. So now that I gave you a quick little geometry lesson there, what we're doing now is mixing this up. So I'm using, once again, that Fathom Total Boat 2-to-1 deep pour epoxy mixture. And here you get a nice video of my feet, and the dogs are out right now. So I was doing this in the morning so it could dry all day, and it was actually kind of helpful because I just mixed up these two in a cooking bowl, and then obviously I threw this bad boy away, but just mix it up in there with a scrap piece of wood and then put in the charcoal mixture. So this is a charcoal mixture. I actually just got it off of Amazon, and it actually turned out really well. I was worried about getting something that was relatively inexpensive, but with the price of it, never heard of the brand, it actually worked out really well. So this is my favorite part, and what everyone sees all over YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, it's the epoxy pour. And this is what we're doing right now. It's just dumping it all in there. And as you can see, we have the color, the little bit of shine, the little bit of shimmer, the little bit of quietness. This is a little bit of everything in this epoxy. So I was really excited how the mixture turned out and actually how the pour was. You can see the math was almost right on. I literally used exactly how much I needed. Measurements were right, math was right. So you know I did get an A in geometry based upon this pour. But long story short, enough with the jokes. This is actually a really exciting situation because pours like this can be tricky, but we got the exact amount we wanted. We just wanted to fill it up to the brim and not any more. We didn't waste any epoxy, and we didn't really make too much of a mess. Anything you can see on the outside is something we can sand off, which really isn't a big deal, but I wanted to make sure the epoxy didn't actually overflow too much. So as we talked about before, we are going to have to pop these bubbles with the blowtorch, and this isn't really a big deal. You just have to do it every few hours depending on how the bubbles form. But the interesting part is here, you can see how the structure kind of solidifies, but to make the cool designs, you can actually take, what I have here is just a toothpick that you can get from any doctor, dentist, Walmart, pharmacy, and you just mix it up. This is clean. It was great because there's no dust on these since they're sealed. And you just make little swirls. But the key is you don't want to go super deep because that's going to cause a bunch of bubbles and cause a lot of issues. You just want to break the surface tension of the epoxy, make whatever designs you want, and then you're all set. So the interesting thing is I left this out in my garage, and for 4 days it didn't really cure because it was about 30 degrees out. So what I had to do is actually bring it inside and let it cure for the rest of the time, which is about probably 24 hours more. So the next part here is what we're doing is actually getting it all set up. I'm right in my living room, which is kind of interesting. And once again, I'm going to shim the board to make sure it's level. But now that we have the actual epoxy cured, this is the deep pour epoxy, we need to go back and actually do the final step before the sanding, which is the sealant, or also known as the tabletop epoxy. So you have to buy two different types. This is once again from Total Boat. They offer pretty good stuff from what I understand. I've always had good experience with them. But this is a 1-to-1 mixture. So what we're doing here is just eyeing it up. This, once again, people may argue with it. I don't believe it's a super big deal. If you can get it roughly the same level, that's all you need. Some people measure it by weight, which is probably the most accurate way, but not something that I was really too worried about. So while you're doing this, you want to make sure your epoxy's warm. You have a lot better chance of getting a cleaner pour. And don't mind all the dishes in the sink. It was the maid was out that day. But the thing is that once you have that epoxy warmed up, you're ready to pour. So you're mixing it, you have it warmed up, it gets a much more even pour. And then from there, you just got to do it. So you'll be happy to know that I actually got the Mr. Clean special gloves for all the protection that I need. So I'm finally starting to listen to my advice. But what we're doing here is just spreading out this final layer of epoxy, and then we're going to spread it out by hand. You know, I realized here that I didn't have enough mixed up, so which it really isn't a big deal. Like I said, this has a shorter working time than the deep pour one I used before, so I had to act quick. But once I spread everything out, I was actually able to go back and mix up a little bit more and make a second pour. Now what I like to do is start in the center and then work my way out. And I want to make sure I get all the corners, and it's okay if it drips over. You're going to have to do a lot of sanding later. But what we want to do is make sure the top and the sides are all sealed. So once the top is covered, I actually just ran my finger around on the outside to make sure all the wood at least have one layer of cover. And then as this settles, it's considered self-leveling. It will actually spread out on its own. So you'll have more overflow as time goes on. So what we're doing here is we're back in the shop after being in the living room, and we're sanding from 80 all the way up to 600 grit. And this is going to be a dry sand compared to the next one, which is going to be a wet sand as we get higher and higher in grits. It's important here to make even strokes and go back and forth in circles in different directions so we don't make any specific lines. Now, like I said, we're going from 800 all the way up to 3,000, and we're doing this by hand, and it's called a wet sand. So I'm sure the people out there that are into automotive stuff probably have an opinion on this. So if there's a better way of doing this, always let me know. Now, once again, we're going in all different directions, side to side, back and forth, in circles, just to make sure we cover everything. And you'll notice that I haven't really hit the sides a lot. I'm trying to go for a contrast color here, and we're gonna see how it turns out. I think eventually I will probably come back and hit the edges a little bit more because they are still a little rough, but I like right now how we're seeing a contrast between the sides and the top. So now that we get all the sanding done, it still doesn't look perfect. It looks more of like a frosted color here. You can see there are some bubbles we have to get out, but what we're gonna do now is just do the polishing compound. And this is the M3 three-step polishing compound. So there's a 1, a 2, and a 3-step formula. This is gonna be cutting it from the roughest grade all the way down to the finest grade. Now right here, I'm starting with the first one and I'm just working it around slowly. And I actually have a wool skin pad on my sander right now, and that's actually what I'm using to cover all this up. So after the first round, you can see we're wiping it all off and we're starting to see that shine come out. We do need to use 2 and 3 to get the full shine effect, but I'm liking how this is looking so far. Now here's step 2 and actually step 3 mixed together. And what we're doing is after the step 2, there wasn't a big difference. So I actually went up to step 3. And here is what we're seeing after we put on the M3 1, 2, 3 combo. And now we're wiping it off. Now I added a little bit of water here. They didn't say to do this, but I felt like it gave it a better shine, even though you really can't see the effect over the camera. And now the hardest part was because I didn't really put the separation beneath the board in my actual woodworking piece. So the epoxy actually glued to the board, which is what I was not hoping for. But you know what? With a little elbow grease, we were able to get this bad boy out. And there we go, the fire and epoxy table board. As always, thank you so much for watching. And like I said, Cam from Blacktail Studios, thank you so much for inspiring this great idea. Have a great day, everyone.